where you have a program and you can't do it on your own. So then you go ahead and you find the group that can help you do it together. If you're doing a partnership just for the funding, you should be really careful to make sure that you're aligned on what you're going to get out of it and how.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Monica Rosoff, the founder and CEO of LBBAL Alianza. LBBAL is spelled LBBAL. Prior to launching Alianza, Monica was a partnering executive with roles of increasing seniority at Genentech, Gilead, Kite, and Exelixis. Over the course of over 2 decades, she had the opportunity to lead and participate in a wide diversity of deals, negotiations, diligence exercises, alliances, technology transfers, M&A integrations, dispute resolution negotiations, amendments, and terminations at all stages of the drug development and commercialization lifecycle and in multiple therapeutic areas. Dr. Rosoff earned a doctorate in pharmacology from the University of Washington and conducted her postdoctoral work at Stanford. As you will learn during the show, Monica comes with a lot of experience on the scientific aspects of drug development as well. I first met Monica around 2012 at a conference in Washington, D.C., and we have interacted several times since then. I thought she would be a great guest on this show to speak about alliance management for early-stage therapeutic startups. Hope you find this useful. All right, Monica, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I've spoken to many founders on this show who are developing novel therapeutics. And a common theme that has emerged is the importance of partnerships with big pharma and biotech companies. And recently I had a fascinating conversation with Corey Goodman, you know him pretty well, which deepened my interest on the subject of partnering with big biotech and pharma companies for early stage companies. And I think our audience will greatly benefit from expert insights on navigating these partnerships. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. And in my career, I've had the privilege of watching partnerships go well and go poorly, both from the small company and the big company standpoint, but mostly from the big company watching the small company either succeed or fail in the partnerships. And so the first thing I guess I would mention is that for small companies, I do see that it's so important. They really care about having partnerships. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the validation that that provides. That when you have a partnership with big pharma and you're a small company, that can really indicate to others that the pharma company thinks that you have something valuable to offer, that there's a future for you. And so I think that's really a big part of it. Then there's also, of course, the financial benefits, right? Like the influx of cash. And sometimes those partnerships come with like an investment in the actual company itself too. So there's a lot of benefits to it.
Yeah,
you know?
There's expertise, there's resources, there's finances, a lot to delve into. Perhaps we could begin by exploring your own fascination with this space. How did you start your journey in this alliance management or partnership management?
So I'm a scientist by training. I got a PhD in pharmacology and I did developmental biology. And that's why I know of Corey Goodman, because he started in that field as well. And I like to joke that people that worked on certain pathways, I was an expert in the Wnt pathway. That's not a druggable pathway or not very druggable. And so people that come from certain backgrounds, and I worked on frogs. So people that come from certain backgrounds end up in applied fields because we couldn't really do research in our own chosen field, science-wise, like signal transduction-wise. So that's how I ended up switching from like a research role to a business development partnering role. And that took a while. I didn't go directly to it. I had roles that involved project management, operations. Like for a while, I managed a team of scientists who did knowledge entry at Ingenuity Systems. I worked at a microfluidics company. I did a lot of tech transfer. I worked at Lynx Therapeutics when it was back in the day doing NGS, even before Illumina. And so I've just had a diversity of experiences. And what I like about alliance management and partnering is that it's something where you kind of use everything. You basically used all of your scientific knowledge and all of the business knowledge, all of the project management, engineering, it all comes into play if you're really like putting together a deal or making a deal happen or getting a therapeutic to market, hopefully. So it's a great role if you kind of like to be a jack of all trades. And I love science, and you get to see it so much because it's not like you're looking at one or two programs. You get exposed to dozens and dozens of programs. So if you're greedy and you like to see a lot, it's a great option.
That's a nice way of putting it. Maybe I'll go back to what we talked about on Corey's podcast about early stage biotech and pharma startups, right? It is impossible for a founder, a scientific founder, to get all these experiences that you mentioned and then start building a therapeutic and go to the market by themselves. So most successful startups have gotten into partnerships for the reasons you mentioned early on. Even Corey agreed with that. It's hard for one person to do it. So partnerships are great. So let's dive into the heart of partnership management. Can you walk us through the core principles that guide successful partnerships in this field?
Yeah, of course. So there's a few things that I think are really critical as a sort of foundation for a good partnership. And then there's additional principles that I think guide people the whole way through. But basically, the best partnerships are not partnerships that just, for example, one company gives the other company money and that's it. Or it's very transactional. The best partnerships are where two companies can bring together their expertise and do something that's more than what they could have done alone. More, faster, better, things like that. So you really want to have a synergy in the skill set and in the result. And also the best partnerships have a sort of timing driver. It really should matter to both partners to get something done in a certain time frame. And that's something that's sometimes very challenging, in particular for the small biotechs if they're working with pharma, because pharma is in it for the long game. And they always want everything. And biotech, they got a runway. They have only so many dollars and so much time. And so they got to do something with what they have. And so those don't necessarily match up. So the timing is very important. There has to be alignment there. And also motivation. If it's sort of like life or death for the small company, and it really doesn't matter to the large company as to whether the partnership succeeds, that's a problem. Because then you're sort of at the mercy of the whims of the senior management at the larger company. You really would rather be in a situation where it really matters to everybody, whatever the objective is, the data set get generated or the regulatory filing be submitted or whatever, that it really matters to everybody. So that's the basics. But then beyond that, the most important thing, people hear it a lot, but it really is true, is if everyone's focused on the therapeutic and what's best for the patient, that is one of the very best ways of making sure that everyone gets aligned and comes to agreement, because it's easy to sort of focus on what you want and then not here and now, or different people can have very strong, very valid opinions about maybe the scientific strategy. And there's lots of ways where things can kind of get a little messy. But if you always sort of focus on what's best for the patient, what's the patient going to need, that really helps to kind of cut through some of that and come to agreement. So a philosophical agreement on sort of the objectives is really critical in terms of the foundation. And then beyond that, it sounds super simple, but honestly, a lot of the rest of it is asking the right questions and really exercising, being rigorous in how you do things, turning things around, being collaborative, really building up that trust and doing what you say, and really sort of being reliable as a partner, being a good partner. It's really no different than being a good colleague or anything. It's really executing on first principles and best practices. It sounds really simple. It's not easy to do.
Yeah. Speaking of first principles, maybe we'll go very basic, okay? If I'm a founder of a startup, a biotech, developing some therapeutic, who should be the first point of contact at that big company? And you mentioned something about timing, right? A lot of times I've seen the BD people on the sales mode. They are
Yeah.
always like peppy. They're like pumping up energy. Like, how do you tweak out if the timing is right or not? And who should be that first person we should approach?
Well, it never hurts to connect with everybody you can. But really, the critical question is who are the decision makers for that company? If it's a large pharma, is it the chief scientific officer? Is it the chief medical officer? Is it the head of BD? Is there a key scientist that's just maybe in the development team or a clinician or a research scientist that's really, really influential? Because really what you need to figure out is who's going to decide and put their weight behind that. It could even be an external advisor. So I think a lot of times it's really important to try to understand the dynamics around the decision making within the company to understand who you need to target. Because the business development team may be the critical team, but it could also be that they basically just collect a bunch of opportunities and then they go to their review committee. And then that's when the decision making happens as to what's of interest and what's not. And you need that advocate. So figuring out who's going to advocate for you is very critical.
Yeah, identifying the right kind of people is super, super important. Otherwise, you're just going down a wrong kind of rabbit hole.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, you probably have scientific advisors in your own company that you've founded, and they may have a pretty direct connection to folks at the larger company that you're partnering with. And so understanding and investigating what the degrees of separation are, how many degrees of freedom are there between two groups, it's really important because you need to understand who's going to make that decision. And in terms of whether it's going well or not, when things are going well, they go fast.
Yeah.
And so if you're doing many, many cycles and nothing's happened, then you should know that there's not much hope that that's going to happen. Usually things can happen pretty quickly, or it's not like we were talking about, it's not the right time. Maybe the data set just isn't there yet. And then in that case, it's just, you got to wait till the data set is ready and then it'll happen.
Speaking of, if you're on the startup side, like, are there one or two questions you ask the big company in evaluating if it's a good partner?
Yeah. I mean, I would be asking them exactly what they're looking for in terms of what their objective is. What data set do they want? I mean, are they very specific in what they're looking for? Are they detail oriented in their diligence? It should be pretty clear what their objectives are. I mean, are they looking to break into a new therapeutic area, or is this their core therapeutic area? Do they have the right experts in-house to actually make this work? And also, if it's a big, big company, if they in-license this, maybe they in-license a therapeutic, for example, do they have their own internal program? How is this going to fit? How can I make sure that they actually are going to allocate the expertise and the time and the money to the program that they're taking over? How are they going to push this forward? It's really important to ask those sorts of questions and to try to gauge whether the management is committed.
Maybe this is a good point to talk about something that comes up about partnerships is trust. Building trust goes without saying. It's very, very important. What are the mistakes people do? Either over-promising or give us the basics. Like, how do you build that trust into any relation, especially in this partnership space?
That's a great question. And it's such a difficult one to answer. So there's a few things. I would always recommend doing due diligence on people, even before you meet them, if you can. Look at their expertise, look at where they've been. Maybe you know someone that knows someone that like you can get some background. But that being said, I think it's also really important to make up your own mind once you meet someone. So what I tend to do is if I'm meeting a potential partner for the first time, I really try to pay attention to their body language. Who do they speak with? Do they speak with everyone? Do they just speak with the one decision maker in the room from the other company? Like, what's their demeanor? How do they interact? Do they seem interested in getting to know the people on the other side? That's really important because, I mean, if they're really intending to develop a therapeutic, they're going to want to know what the team is like and do they know their stuff? And they'll have different sorts of questions. Are they engaged? So there's a lot that you can learn just by the way they act. And then if you end up doing a deal, again, how dependable are people? If someone says that they're going to do something, do they actually do it? Is there a changing message or an evolving story? Or do decisions get reversed over time? Those sorts of things are very important. So I think that that's the kind of thing that I look for is just consistency, truth. And I'm huge on making sure that you build a relationship and you hear what people have to say, but then you also seek to confirm. You look at the data, you request the appropriate document, you review things. So you always verify as well as trust.
I think due diligence is such an important thing in almost every aspect of running a startup. It's a hard question. Who should be doing that due diligence? Like inexperienced founder might not know what to expect in that diligence process. Like, what are the best practices? Like, do we bring in somebody else to do this for us, or is it the founder's responsibility?
Well, I definitely think that the founders are accountable. So it's up to them to figure out what they need. But if you don't know something, then you absolutely should bring in experts to help you. So the better the diligence, the more likely you are to set yourself up for success. And so I think that the key thing for the founders or for anyone that's running a company that needs to do a due diligence is that someone needs to be 100% accountable for that diligence. And so even if you don't know something, you need to find the person that does. And so in my experience, it's really hard to cover everything. You just can't. I mean,
you don't know what you don't know, like most of the first time founders.
Yeah. What if you're a biologist and you need to cover software or there's a quality systems question, or you're a small molecule guy and there's an antibody design question that you don't know. There's all these possibilities. So I guess the key thing is to be really clear on what the key questions are that will validate your assumptions as to why a deal is a good deal. That could be like the proof of concept data. It could be the cost of goods if there's a manufacturing aspect. There's certain key assumptions that you're going to have to be able to confirm to know that the value that you're either asking for or paying for is the appropriate thing to do and that the plan is correct. And then if you don't have that knowledge, you need to find someone who does. And ideally do it quickly, because usually you're not the only ones looking. So that's the other thing. If you're doing it on your own, you may or may not be able to do it quick enough.
Yeah, it's a very big point, trying to find the right people. But I want to go back to something you mentioned about people not delivering on something they promised. Say a big pharma says, I'm going to do this study, or these are the data points I'm going to get. There's always this power dynamic. There's a big company, mammoth, with a lot of money, small, tiny startup. Like, how do you strike a balance there? You're always scared as a founder, right? Like, you're a small company, they could always kick you out. How should one approach that?
That's another really good question. And the funny thing is that in the end, I find that it's very difficult to force anyone to do anything, whether it's a big company or a small company. I mean, clearly, if you're a small company and you have a behemoth that you're working with as a partner, then there's a huge power imbalance. And so I think that the key there is that that deal should ideally be executed for the right reasons. I mean, if they care about you, they will care about the deal and they'll care about your expertise and your opinion, and they'll treat the deal appropriately. So I think that it's really about kind of relying on that mutual motivation that like both parties will really benefit from being successful. If you don't have that alignment in the interests, then it's a huge problem. And as someone who manages alliances, that's one of the key things I look for when I'm looking at term sheets, for example, is if it's really one-sided, which sometimes it is, the pharma company or the big company, there's a difference in the power. And so maybe the terms are really beneficial to one company. Those deals never go well, because the problem with those deals is that they're so bad for one company that eventually they'll fall apart. Either the company may lose money, or like if you're a small company and you do that kind of a deal where you really don't get what you need out of it, you're not going to be able to sell your company later because you've given the value away. And so it's really, really, really important to have that aligned interest. So that's one thing. And the other is that you really need to communicate clearly, because sometimes people don't, it's not that they even intend to not do things that you need, it's that they don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe they're just not clear. So building up a really good level of communication and trust with the counterparts, not with a huge team, but just the key people, that's very, very important. And I've seen partnerships where one company is incredibly profitable and much bigger. Maybe it's not even another company. Maybe it's an institute or something that's on the other side. They rely heavily on relationship and on consistency and on the high quality of the science. And that really matters. And it can be very successful, but it has to be with the right executive that cares about getting that therapeutic to the patients.
Do you have any examples of a case where a big pharma had this like lopsided terms that were beneficial for them and not for the startup? Like if you were on the startup side, how did you deal with that? How do you push back is where I'm trying to get at if there's a specific example.
Well, I think that the best thing to do is to break it down for them as to why it's so lopsided, it makes no sense. So maybe there's funding a certain amount of research every quarter, a certain amount of money. And the research plan stipulates you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z in that time frame. If the money that's being funded isn't sufficient to actually do that work, or the timelines that are maybe in the agreement aren't long enough to maybe either hire the right people or carry out the appropriate tox study. Basically, I like to say the math doesn't work. Then it's really important to break it down and explain it to the other party because they may not realize that. A lot of times the bigger pharmas or just companies in general, they really want to get the deal done. They try to make it simple because that way it's easier to get the deal done. But sometimes the plans don't quite jibe. And so it's really important to just break it down and be like, this is what we need to be successful and this is why. And if you can do that, then you're very likely to actually have things move.
And I think this is not for the weak-minded for sure. The founder or the startup should really be like strong-willed and be very realistic rather than saying, like, most grad students and postdocs, they used to saying, yes, I'll do it to the professor. And then they go into that mode and they sometimes lose track of the reality of like how much something might cost or you'll be in the loss. Speak of all of that and the team, do lawyers come into this place at all?
Personally, I have a really soft spot in my heart for my lawyer colleagues because they're there to help you. I mean, that's what lawyers are there to do, is to help you. However, lawyers, their expertise is agreements, right? I mean, by definition, they're really interested in the details. They're there to protect you. I mean, their fiduciary duty is to do the best for you. And so it's really important to be clear on what your priorities are as a founder, because you need to tell them that and make sure that the tail doesn't wag the dog. And I don't say that in a disrespectful way at all. It's just that the best lawyers will listen to their business client and they'll do what they ask. And so you need to be really clear on what your objectives are and what you're willing to prioritize and what you can sort of be flexible on. And just ask clarifying questions so that you really understand what the lawyers are trying to achieve. They always have a good objective in mind, but sometimes it's really hard for everyone to be on the same page as to what that precisely is. And it's viewed as maybe a pain in the butt to deal with some of the legal constraints.
Yeah. In the whole of this story so far, one thing reverberating again is communication. I think the founders has to be super, super clear. They need to have the clarity of mind and communicate that properly.
Yeah, no, the clarity is so important because like you said, I mean, it's really tempting to kind of hope for the best and say, I'll take it. I need validation. I'll take it. This is the best deal I'm going to get. It's this or nothing. And what's really important is to understand what's around the corner. How can you plan ahead and to really have that clarity? Because that'll allow you to communicate with a potential partner, with a lawyer. Maybe you're compromising on one thing. Well, maybe that means that you have to get a second deal or, you have to have plan B on how you're going to do what you couldn't achieve with the first deal if you couldn't get everything you wanted. So that clarity is really important, that clear thinking. Yes. Yeah. And there's lots of people out there that can help you with that too. That's the thing, is you shouldn't go it alone.
I agree with that. I'm trying to think another difficult question. I think, most founders are going to be first-time founders, especially these people. They tend to say yes, just because, say, a big company like AstraZeneca comes, we're talking and you always want to please them. That pleasing mentality exists in scientists a lot more than other people. And say they're not able to deliver on a certain goal, or tell us more about communicating that failure better to deal that partnership. Than waiting till the end, I guess.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I liken it to, you're going to be late. Maybe you're driving from point A to point B in the Bay Area and you're going to be late. You're going to be at least 30 minutes late. Do you tell people right away or do you wait till you're 5 minutes away and then call? It's sort of similar. The sooner that you can advise, usually the better. That being said, the strategy you have on how you're going to communicate and when is also very important because people pleasing comes in various different flavors, right? One flavor is, yes, I'm going to do that. You asked for that, I'll do it. You want this other data set? Absolutely, we'll do it. You think we should have this control? Okay. But other types of people pleasing is, I don't want to tell you that something went wrong. You try to avoid it. You try to maybe see if there's a way to fix it. So there's maybe failure to communicate, or there's other ways that people pleasing comes about that are not necessarily just saying yes. So one technique that I think is really helpful is to think of yourself as sort of the steward of the program, right? You're the advocate of the program. You're not speaking for yourself. You're speaking for the program. And so what does the program need? And if you can do that and actually practice, I mean, in my role, I actually practice saying no. So I'll say, I can't say yes to this. I must decline for these reasons, because if I want this to succeed, I actually have to say no right now and then explain why and what would set it up for success. It's sort of like that you can do A or you can do B. You have choices, but you don't have to just go with the option that's provided just by the other party.
Yeah.
Sort of opening it up.
I think Steve Jobs say this, right? Like saying no is the most powerful thing you have. And how many things you can do right as opposed to wrong is what determines your success or failure.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And when I was at Gilead, when John Martin was alive, he had it was kind of funny at the time, but it's a great technique or a great practice. And that, you know how you have lists of to-dos? He had lists of to-don'ts. And so even before something comes up, you should be pretty clear on what you shouldn't be doing. And that'll also help with these sorts of situations where someone comes and says, I'd like you to do this. You can be like, well, thank you. And I appreciate you thinking about it. But we've thought about that too. And we think this is the better way, or this is why we haven't pursued that. And very graciously and firmly turn it down. And sometimes it's not even like you're going to turn it down forever, but you don't have to say yes right away. Thank you for bringing that up. I need to think about it. I'll get back to you. There's a lot of sort of simple techniques that can help that don't necessarily mean that you're difficult, or it's just a matter of practice, I think. Very important for founders.
I like this two don'ts list of two don'ts.
Yeah, isn't that nice? I think that's a really good one.
I need to have my wife talk to you. She has this long list of to do's and always saying yes. After you come back to the States, I'm going to have a talk to you.
Sounds good. Yeah. No, I mean, I think about that a lot because, I mean, the thing is that if you say yes to everything, you're by default not doing certain things that maybe are more important.
Absolutely.
So thinking about what you're not going to do, this is a general perspective thing, not just a partnering thing, is really important for developing executives to be very clear on what they think is a good thing to do and where they want to invest their time and efforts and what is not worth it.
Yeah. Thank you for those inputs. I'm going to slightly shift the gears and talk about your personal journey. Let's start with the success stories. What is one of the most successful alliances you've managed, and what do you think contributed to that success? If there's one story you can tell.
Well, I've been fortunate because I've been a part of a really huge number of alliances by now. But one that sticks out for me, I'll bring up a couple, and I think it's a fairly public story, is the alliance that Gilead struck with the IOCB in the Czech Republic and with the KU Leuven in Belgium to develop tenofovir as a therapeutic for HIV. That's the story of the development of that antiviral and how successful it is. It's just incredible. And to this day, it's hard for me to believe that there's no Nobel Prize that hasn't been issued, given the millions of people that have been treated with that particular drug. That's to me, and I didn't get to witness that from the beginning, but that particular story is one of the most amazing success stories from a partnership perspective that I know of in pharma and in biotech. And it really happened because the key individuals, the key scientists, John Martin and others, built a relationship with Tony Holy, with the folks in KU Leuven as well, and really were persistent. They were focused. They knew what scientific questions they wanted to ask. They had the long game in mind. They weren't focused on sort of the first data set. They were really very, very persistent. And I think that that's part of what made this so successful, is that there was a lot of trust, a lot of patience, and a lot of grit to keep going to get this drug developed. And it's a story that goes for decades. Some of the agreements that I saw when I was assigned that particular alliance at Gilead were from the 90s, right? I mean, it was a long alliance. And so it's very, very impressive what was achieved with that particular alliance. And I think a lot of it was just very basic, important behaviors like being very rigorous about the science and being very committed and being willing to take the calls. Like I know from personal experience that John Martin, when he was CEO, would take his partner's calls personally. So it just is a level of commitment all the way to the top that really is important to make something succeed.
Yeah, looks like having that fundamental relation between the scientists and then asking the right question, having a mutual interest or incentive in solving a scientific problem, I think that is core.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing is that it really depends what you mean by success too for a partnership. So a partnership can be wildly successful financially. It can be wildly successful in terms of the number of patients treated. It can even be successful even when there's conflict. I mean, you can have partnerships that are very successful where you still end up like fighting with your partners quite a bit. And that's actually not necessarily always a bad thing. It just means that there's tension in the interests and you have to work through it, but you're still successful because you still develop a very important therapeutic and patients benefit. So sometimes if you're really going to go all the way, you end up having to live some tough moments with your partner. I won't reveal which company, but I definitely have situations where I got a call and I said, well, our CEO is going to call your CEO if XYZ doesn't get solved now. And it did get solved. And that direct communication is there. And that's okay. I mean, that's actually something that in this industry, you have to kind of be ready for. And that's a big learning curve for founders, like we were talking about with the sort of saying no and being tough, making sure that you stick to your guns when you need to. It's tough, but it's something that is actually very important for these successful partnerships.
Yeah, conflict can be good also sometimes. Maybe it'll just speed up the results.
It's necessary sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. What were the most challenging aspects you found when you were involved in some alliance management? Any 2 or 3 things that if there's any repeating problems that come?
Oh, there's always repeating problems. There's no lack of problems.
Let's go with the top 3 at least, because I want the audience to be aware of those things so that they prepare 3 or 4 if they come to your mind.
Well, I think one of the most common one is lack of internal alignment. So you'd think that the biggest challenge is just aligning with your partner, getting on the same page, making sure that you agree on the terms or you agree that the data set is complete or whatever. But actually, a lot of times the challenge is internal alignment and making sure that internally within your company, whether it be a small biotech or a large pharma, that the leadership team is aligned and that everyone is committed to proceeding a certain way. That is by far the biggest challenge with every partnership.
Get your ducks in row internally first.
Exactly. And that's no different for internal programs versus external programs, right? The external programs, it tends to muddy the waters and it's easy to kind of think, oh, it's the partner. But often it's really not. Yeah. A lot of times it's an internal issue that needs to get resolved. So it's really important to get people in a room and just really hash things out if needed so that you really know where everyone stands regarding a decision or if you're going to escalate something or you're going to move forward. It's really important to make sure that everyone's on the same page. That's the most important thing or the top item. Another really common one, and I think it's actually very prominent right now, is when there's a lack of funding. So either a company runs out of money or perhaps like we were talking about, maybe a small company agreed to a program that they actually can't afford. Maybe the manufacturing costs are too high. But basically, I have observed companies to run out of money, go bankrupt, those sorts of things. And so sometimes there's things that are really basic that you can do to help yourself. So for example, some pharmas, if they're going to pay you your milestone payment or quarterly R&D funding or whatever, making sure that those reimbursements come in quickly and don't take like 120 days to come in actually makes a difference. So there's times in my role, if I'm at the larger company, where I will actually go out of my way to advocate that those payments get made quick. Because it may not matter that much to the big company, but boy, it really, really matters to the small company.
Life or death.
Yeah, life or death. Exactly. Or maybe there's certain expenses that are pass-through expenses that the larger company can assume directly with the right consents that will help the smaller company preserve its resources and just make things a little bit easier for them. So that's another really prominent one. And then on the sort of early stage research side in particular, but also for clinical, is just making sure that from a clinical or scientific point of view, that there's actual alignment on the philosophy. And I'm talking about things like, what scientific model are you using? How important are the data that you're generating? Do they really convince people? So like basically having that scientific alignment is really key. And I find that sometimes that's really not quite pressure tested enough. So then you finish your program, you get your results, and then one group is like, well, we did it. It worked great. And the other company is like, we really think this other thing is going to validate better. Or, we think that we need this other data set. And so just being clear on that is so important. But finding out 2/3 of the way through the research program is not the time to find it, right? Or to learn that. But it happens a lot. Or sadly, you get a turnover and the opinions of the first group that you're working with are different than the second group. So if that does happen, kind of catching that and saying, okay, do we need to change things? Much better than putting your head down and just hoping for the best.
Yeah, that's a nice list. Like, I think aligning the internal partners first during a partnership, that's super important. Take care of the funding issues ahead of time. Don't wait till the last minute because you might just go bankrupt. That won't work. And agreeing on the philosophy, especially on the scientific methods, I think they're all great lists. One other question that came up from my friends in the space is how structural changes happen at the big company or the small company. People leave, priorities change. There's no way to prepare for that. Like, were you in a situation like that, and how do you deal with that with the transition, right? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, I think both when I was at Genentech and at Gilead, really, like I lived through a couple different iterations of each company, right? Depending on the leadership teams and what acquisitions had happened, M&A that had happened at the time. So you do go through some amazing, really intense changes in terms of leadership and philosophy. And it's really important, whether you're a big company or a small company, is to be very adaptable. First of all, you need to know what your assumptions were and what sort of the situation was at point A. And then if things change, then as much as possible, it's important to be able to kind of verbalize that. What's different? Or what are we worried about? Or, what is the change? And what is the difference in priority? Is there a new therapeutic area? Like, for example, what happened at Genentech recently, where Ira Mellman's whole team, they decided to deprioritize immuno-oncology. What does that mean for partnerships, right? I'm not involved in that anymore, but that's a perfect example where you need to really understand how these things have an impact on you and be able to ask those questions. So be able to kind of be like, from situation 1 to situation 2 to situation 3, if there's 3 transitions, what's the differences? And can we mitigate those in some way? Or do we need to change the plan? Sometimes having that open conversation is really helpful, as opposed to just kind of hoping that things don't change, is to just be very open about it if you can. Sometimes it's impossible.
Yeah. Just speaking of communication and conflicts, I think they are inevitable in most of the cases, whether small or big. Any advice on resolution of those conflicts? Anything that you use or anything that comes to your mind, which was tough, but you were able to resolve?
Yeah. So my first suggestion is be clear on what the outcome, if you're going to pick a fight with someone, make sure that you know what the potential outcomes are before you do that. Is one outcome termination? What are the potential consequences of something? And whether you feel like you're in the right or that you are maybe not, you need to know what the potential consequences are of any sort of conflict. So doing a little bit of game theory ahead of time is really, really critical. But in terms of sort of conflicts I've lived through and survived or whatever, I think that most of them, with fortitude, you can survive if there's really a willingness on all fronts. The ones that are really hard to overcome are the ones where either there's an IP issue that then causes a commercialization issue, or some other sort of issue where basically it makes no financial sense to continue with the program. It just simply won't pay for itself. Or, for example, scientifically, maybe you developed a therapeutic and somebody comes along with a better drug, and all of a sudden your partnership means nothing because it's done, right?
Yeah.
That drug's never going to make it to the patients anymore. In those situations, there's no point in fighting. You might as well just kind of amicably come to a good resolution or a wind down or whatever. But in terms of the most common types of conflicts that I see, I think that some of them are what I was mentioning before, philosophical differences in the science. In those sorts of cases, it's really up to the senior management leading both parties to lead the teams to a good resolution and not let the teams just have a festering fight. Then there's interpersonal conflict. I actually have seen a lot of that where somebody has a behavioral issue. Maybe there's yelling, there's aggressive behavior, those sorts of things. That happens, and there's no place for it. And so being able to call those out and maybe remove those people from that situation is sort of a person problem. If you run into one of those, is really important to be able to just sort of identify that and then try to remove that person from the whole interaction. That can be really tough if it happens to be someone that's like linchpin.
Senior, yeah.
But in that case, then you have to ask, well, if it's someone that's never going to go away, then you need to just either figure out a way to deal with that and have a workaround to function, or you need to walk away. That's basically your options. And then the other time that you see conflict is maybe one party is actually not on the up and up. Maybe they didn't deliver the data that they said they would. And they're just basically like, sorry, we're not going to do any more. Then you're really faced with sort of mediation or conflict resolution. And in those cases, I think the most important thing is to really be clear on what the problem is so that you can be able to explain it and ideally understand what are the options to resolve it.
Yeah, I really like your advice on think about the potential consequences before you pick up a fight with somebody.
Because you never know. You could be totally in the right. And that doesn't mean you're going to necessarily win. I'll give you a blinded example that's fairly egregious and hard to believe. So one of my reports was managing a collaboration, an early stage collaboration, where there was a therapeutic that was being developed by a smaller company. And the team at the larger company was pretty impressed with the scientific acumen of the smaller company, and they were pretty excited. So they started generating the data. And it was a situation where the research plan wanted 3 different potential compounds to be developed. Okay. And I'm intentionally not saying what kind, like antibody or small molecule or whatever. I'm just keeping it really general. And so they did. But it turns out that they were basically like A prime, and A prime prime. They were pretty much the same thing with just like a tiny little tweak. And that was definitely not in the spirit of what had been worked out. So the larger company brought it up and said, this doesn't meet the research plan. And the smaller company, I think, was motivated by the fact that they had limited resources. So they were kind of trying to slam the plan through with as little effort as possible. And the data that they had generated was good, but it was not the complete data set that had been envisioned. And so the bigger company brought it up, escalated it, and it got to the point where it was going to the board, right? It got past the CEO, it was going to the board. And the board didn't want to engage on it either. They were just basically like, because the thing is that they wanted to trigger a milestone payment based on this incomplete data set. And so the board was like, yeah, well, just pay us half the milestone and we'll call it even. So there's strategies like that where you sort of like split the baby, so to speak. And so people didn't feel comfortable with that because they didn't feel like it was done in good faith. And so we were going to, like the larger company was just going to go ahead and terminate. But there were certain deliverables that needed to be sent as formal notifications. And my boss at the time was a pretty collaborative guy. And so he called the CEO and he explained it again because he really didn't want to have some sort of like actual dispute, like a formal dispute. And the CEO was like, well, I have this medical issue. I'll get to you next week. I promise. I'm really sorry. I can't do it this week. So we delayed the whole thing for maybe a week or two. And in that time, they sent us the formal notice to trigger the milestone, despite the fact that we had all agreed to wait. So there's things like that where it's a bit of a person thing, a bit of a how are you dealing with people. Those sorts of things happen too. And you have to kind of go in eyes wide open that those could happen. And then, the only thing I can say is just you need to basically do your due diligence about people and see how they're behaving and as much as possible, be proactive and really clear as to kind of what your expectations are all the way through. But you can't really avoid that either. But that's a perfect example where I think everyone on the one side felt like they were right, but we ended up like settling.
The whole thing is stopped. It's
But that's,
complicated. You mentioned
yeah.
something about resources, right?
Hmm.
Most of the startups don't have too many resources. Yeah.
Absolutely.
How should startup prioritize and allocate their limited resources when managing these alliances? Some of them get into multiple of those two or three companies at the same time, right? Any advice on that front?
Yeah. I think it's really important to be careful about not burning out your people. I mean, I have personally observed situations where a startup or a smaller company will have, like you say, multiple deals with different companies or even with the same company, but multiple programs. And if you look at the R&D funding and the FTEs and whatnot, that poor person is working like 24/7. So that's not good. So often, actually, I have seen it done where the larger company will actually say, you can't over allocate someone. We'll pay up
Mm.
to 100% or 70% or whatever of someone's time, but not more than that. Because otherwise, there's a temptation to basically have one person be allocated to two or three different programs. And that's not really fair to the person or to the other partners.
Yeah. These are all important topics, and like it's tough even having a conversation. Just
Mm-hmm.
being in the scene and like actually interacting and trying to build this partnership seems really hard. Monica, are there any topics that we haven't covered that you feel are important with partnership management?
I think that one of the topics, and you had mentioned it in the list of kind of like what's important in skills and stuff like that, you highlighted, of course, communication is important. But for example, when I'm going to hire someone that's going to be managing partnerships, one of the key things I look for is logic because you want to have people involved in these partnerships that can see the forest for the trees. And so it's really, really important to make sure that in these partnerships that it's easy to get distracted by behaviors or by something that someone said or just things that in the end are not going to matter all that much. What's important is to be able to identify what the critical things are that you need to focus on and to really make sure that those are taken care of, whether it be hire the right person to do the work or make sure that the talk study is designed properly so it actually answers the questions that you need or whatever the case may be. But to be really clear on what that is. And that is really one of the most important things that you can do. But again, that's no different than an internal program. It's the same. So it's just a matter of finding partnerships where you have a program and you can't do it on your own. So then you go ahead and you find the group that can help you do it together. If you're doing a partnership just for the funding, you should be really careful to make sure that you're aligned on what you're going to get out of it and how.
Very important. Very important. I think a big takeaway from this is having somebody at the table who's understands how partnerships work, and especially if they're experienced, somebody like you. Speaking of you, I see that you've started a consulting firm now. Maybe you can talk a bit about that. So if somebody wants
Yeah.
to approach you, I want to make sure they have access to you.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's great. And I appreciate that. So, first of all, I'll start by saying that if you're at a startup, I do not advocate for you hiring an alliance manager
Mm,
because you need to save your money. And usually you don't need a full time person for that kind of a role because there simply won't be enough alliances where it makes it necessary. And often a lot of the partnering activities will be done by the senior management team at the small company. That's actually very appropriate. And so the reason I started this consulting firm was because I'm so aware of that. At a large company, you can have a big old team of business development and alliance management and even negotiator type people, in addition to multiple teams of legal people and just the works. But at a small company, you really can't do that. And so the reason I started this company is because I wanted to be able to provide that kind of experience to people who may not have it and who certainly shouldn't be hiring it full time. And so if someone needs help, for example, figuring out what kind of structure the R&D plan should have to work well collaboratively, that's one area that you can kind of get to go in and out in a directed fashion, right? You can look at a term sheet and give people advice on that. If someone's responsible at a small company for managing a partnership, you can mentor that person. Maybe meet with them once a month and be like, how's it going? What are your main problems? So there's a lot of ways I wanted to be able to support the scientists and the clinicians in particular and provide them with that knowledge and that experience There's no way, it doesn't make sense to have someone in full time for those sorts of things at that phase. And I love the science. I really do enjoy drug development. So it's a way to kind of apply that in a more directed manner.
Great. Thank you. I will have a link to your website and your email in the show notes. But Monica, you gave a lot to think about. I really sincerely believe founders are going to appreciate everything that you mentioned today. I think they can prepare better, and I hope they'll all reach that stage where they can partner with big companies, and wish them a lot of success. And thank you for covering this ground today. Thank you very much.
You're so welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.